My husband died in June. Pancreatic cancer. 61 years old. From diagnosis to the end was 7 months, which the doctors told us was not unusual for this kind, which is the kind that gives you very little time to argue with it. His name was Daniel. We had been married for 19 years. We had met when I was 32 and he was 34, late enough that we both understood what we were choosing, early enough that we still had a long time ahead of us, or so we thought. He was a quiet man. I want to say that first because it matters to everything that comes after. He was a quiet man who expressed things sideways, through doing, not saying. He fixed things that were broken before you noticed they were broken. He remembered the specific things you mentioned once and never brought up again. He showed up. That was how he loved. He showed up and he stayed and he was there. And for 19 years, I had understood that as the whole of him. I was wrong about the whole of him. I found out in July, 5 weeks after he died. I was sorting through his clothes. It is one of the things that takes longest when someone is gone, the clothes in the closet, which smell like them still and which you cannot look at for weeks, and then one day you can, a little, and then a little more. I was going through his coats, the winter ones, the ones he had not worn in months, the ones that had hung undisturbed through the whole of his illness. I went through the pockets the way you do, checking for receipts, for forgotten things, for the small, ordinary debris of a life. In the inside pocket of his gray coat, I found a key. It was a plain apartment key on a plain ring. No label, no tag. I turned it over in my hand. I did not recognize it. We had house keys and car keys and a key to my mother's place and a small key for the lockbox where we kept our passports. I knew all of our keys. This was not one I knew. I put it on the kitchen counter and I looked at it for 2 days before I did anything about it. On the 3rd day, I took it to the locksmith on Caraway Street, the one who had made copies of our house keys years ago, who kept records of the key blanks he cut. I asked if he could tell me what lock this key belonged to. He looked at it for less than 30 seconds. He said, "That's a residential apartment key. It's a Schlage B series. I can tell you the building. The key blank has a code stamped on it." He looked it up. He said, "Elmwood Arms. It's on Elmwood Avenue, about 2 miles from here. Unit 4B. I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "I'm sure." I drove to Elmwood Avenue alone. I did not call my sister or my daughter or my mother. I did not tell anyone where I was going because I did not know yet what I was going to find, and I needed to find it by myself first, whatever it was, before anyone else's reactions became part of my experience of it. The Elmwood Arms was a small building, 6 units, red brick, a narrow staircase inside. Unit 4B was on the 2nd floor at the end of the hall. I stood outside the door for a long time. Long enough that a man came out of the unit across the hall and looked at me, and I said, "I'm fine, thank you," and he went back inside. I put the key in the lock. It turned. The apartment was small. A single room with a kitchen along one wall and a window that looked out at the brick of the building next door. It was not a comfortable apartment, not a place anyone was living or had been living recently. There was no bed, no couch, no television. There was a desk, plain and wooden, pushed against the wall under the window, a chair, a lamp. And on the desk, and on the single shelf mounted above it, and in the drawers of the desk, and in a wooden crate on the floor beside the desk, notebooks. Dozens of them. All the same kind, black cover, narrow ruled, the kind you can buy at any office supply store for $2. All of them dated on the spine in his handwriting. The earliest one I could find was from 20 years ago, before we were married, from the year we met. The most recent was from April of this year, 2 months before he died. I picked up the one from April, I opened it to the last entry. April 17th. His handwriting, slower than it used to be. The illness had been taking things from him by April, including the steadiness of his hand. But still his handwriting, still recognizable, still his. He had written, "Grace made eggs this morning, the specific kind I like, with the edges slightly crispy. She knows I can't eat much anymore, but she made them anyway and put the plate in front of me like it was any other morning. I ate 4 bites. She didn't say anything about it. She just took the plate away when I was done. I have been thinking about that for 3 hours. The ordinary kindness of it, the way she just keeps being herself. I don't know what I did to deserve 19 years of that. I don't know if anything I've done is enough to deserve it. But I am grateful every single day, and I want that to be written down somewhere." I sat down on the floor, not in the chair, on the floor, with my back against the desk and the notebook in my hands, and the afternoon light from the single window making a rectangle on the wall across from me. He had been writing every day for 20 years. Not every day. I went back and checked eventually over the weeks that followed. Most days. Not every one, but most. A few lines or a few pages, depending on the day. About his work sometimes, about things he'd read or seen or thought about. But mostly, I could see this even in those first hours, sitting on the floor of an apartment I had never known existed. Mostly about me, about our life, about ordinary Tuesday evenings and difficult Saturday mornings, and the specific texture of 19 years of being married to the same person. I don't know when he started renting this apartment. I found receipts in the desk drawer. He had paid cash every month in person, and the receipts went back 11 years. Before that, I don't know. He may have had another place before this one. He may have started writing somewhere else before he found somewhere to keep the notebooks. I may never know the full chronology. What I know is that he had been writing about our life for 20 years and keeping it in a place I didn't know about. And he had left the key in his coat pocket. And in 7 months of illness, he had never told me about it. I have thought about that, the question of whether he intended for me to find it. I think he did. I think the key in the coat pocket was not an accident. He was a man who was careful about things, who noticed details, who kept track. He knew what was in every pocket of every coat. If he had wanted me not to find it, he would have done something about the key before he died. He had 7 months. He did not do anything about the key. He left it for me to find. What I cannot know is whether he would have told me himself if he had lived. Whether this was something he planned to share eventually, or something he planned to leave for me to discover afterward. I have sat with that question for months, and I do not have an answer. I have decided, finally, that I do not need one. He is not here to ask, and speculation is a room you can live in forever if you let yourself. I have chosen not to live there. What I have chosen to do is read. I have read every notebook. It took me the better part of 3 months. I could only do it in small doses, the way you can only look at certain lights for a short time before you have to look away. Some entries made me laugh. Some made me cry in a way that went past crying into something harder to name. Some contained things I had not known he had seen or felt or thought about, things that settled into the picture I had of him and made it more complete. He wrote about the early years of our marriage, when we were still learning each other and making mistakes in the specific ways that 2 people make mistakes in the first years. He wrote about a fight we had in our 3rd year that had been serious, the kind of fight that tests whether a marriage is going to hold. And he wrote about it from his side in a way that made me understand some things I had not fully understood at the time. He was not making excuses. He was trying to see it clearly. He wrote about being afraid, sometimes, that he was not enough. Not enough of what, exactly? He circled this in the notebooks without fully landing on it. Enough of a talker, I think. Enough of someone who said the things out loud. He knew he was quiet. He wrote about it sometimes with a kind of frustration at himself, a sense that he should have been better at saying things, that the doing was not always sufficient. He was wrong about that. The doing was sufficient. The doing was more than sufficient. But I understand now, having read 20 years of what was inside him, that he needed somewhere to put the things he couldn't say out loud. The apartment was that place. The notebooks were that place. Not a secret from me in the sense of being hidden against my interests, not a second life, not a deception. A private room inside himself where he kept the overflow. The things that were too large or too tender or too complicated to make it from his interior to his tongue. He wrote them down instead. Every day for 20 years, approximately. About eggs with crispy edges. About the way I laugh. About a specific Tuesday in November 8 years ago, when I came home from a bad day at work and he had made soup and hadn't asked any questions, and I had cried at the kitchen table, and he had just stayed there. And he wrote, "She needed me to stay, and I stayed. And I don't know if that was the right thing or the wrong thing, or if there even is a right thing in those moments. But I stayed, and she stopped crying eventually, and we ate the soup, and that was the whole evening, and it was enough. It was more than enough." My daughter found out in August. She is 24. She was close to her father, not in the loud, demonstrative way, but in the specific way of two people who are alike without knowing it. Quiet, careful, more interior than exterior. She had grieved him hard, and she was still grieving him in August when I called her and told her what I had found. I told her on the phone first, then in person. I didn't want her to come all the way from her apartment and then have the conversation as a surprise. I told her, "I found an apartment. I found 19 years of notebooks. He wrote about us. About our life, about you." She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "About me?" I said, "About you, often, from when you were born." She came the following weekend. I had pulled a selection of pages, not the whole notebooks, that would have taken weeks, but pages I had marked while reading, entries that mentioned her specifically. She sat at the kitchen table and she read them while I made tea and tried to give her some space while also not being too far away. He had written about her birth. He had written about it at length, 4 pages, the longest single entry I found, dated the day after she arrived. He wrote about holding her for the first time and thinking about what it meant to be responsible for a person who had no idea yet who he was or what he intended to be for her. He wrote, "I have been a particular kind of person my whole life, careful and interior and not very good at announcing myself. I have always thought this was simply who I was. Looking at her, I am thinking for the first time that it might be something I could work on. For her sake. I want to be easier to read. For her sake." He was not easier to read in the end. He was who he was. But he had tried in his way. He had shown up. He had stayed. He had made the soup and not asked questions and been in the room when she needed someone in the room. She read for 2 hours. When she set the pages down, her eyes were red, and her face had the particular look of someone who has just understood something they had been sitting next to without recognizing for a long time. She said, "He was writing this the whole time." I said, "The whole time." She said, "While we were just living, while everything was just normal." I said, "Yes." She said, He was watching and writing and keeping it all somewhere. I said, every day. Nearly every day for 20 years. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Why didn't he just say it?" I said, "I think this was how he said it." She thought about that. I watched her work through it, the frustration of it, the sadness of it, and then, slowly, something else, something closer to recognition. She was more like him than she knew. I had watched her for 24 years move through the world, carrying things she didn't say out loud, keeping them somewhere interior, expressing them sideways through actions and presence rather than words. She said, finally, "I would have liked to know while he was here." I said, "I know." She said, "But I know now." I said, "Yes, you know now." She asked if she could take some of the pages home with her. I said, "Of course." She chose carefully, not randomly, but with the specific deliberateness of someone selecting what they need. She took the entry from her birth, and the entry from her first day of school, and the entry from the year she was 17, and had a hard year, and he had written about watching her move through it and thinking, she has her mother's resilience. She carries it quietly. She doesn't know yet that she has it. She folded the pages carefully. She put them in her bag. She said, "The apartment. What are you going to do with it?" I said, "I've been thinking about that. The apartment on Elmwood is still rented. I kept paying the rent after I found it. I wasn't ready to let it go, and I wasn't sure what the right thing to do with it was. It is a strange kind of space, not comfortable, not pretty, just a desk and a chair and a lamp, and the place where he spent 20 years writing down the things he couldn't say out loud. I have gone back a few times. I sit in the chair at the desk. I look at the window. I try to understand what it was like for him, to need this place, to come here and write and then go home and be the quiet man who showed up, the man who made the soup, the man with the key in his coat pocket. I think I understand it, a little. I think there are people for whom the interior life is so large and so necessary that it requires somewhere to live that is separate from the daily demands of being present. Not a secret against anyone, just a room for the part of themselves that has no other room. He built that room on Elmwood Avenue. He filled it for 20 years. He left the key in his coat. I have decided to keep the apartment for another year. Not to use it, just to have it. Just to know it's there. At the end of the year, I will decide whether to let it go or to keep going with it. Maybe I will start writing there myself. He left the desk. He left the chair. He left the lamp and the shelf and 20 years of notebooks that I have read twice now and will probably read again. The last notebook is in my bedside drawer. Some nights I open it to any page and I read whatever I find. Last night I found an entry from 3 years ago. We had been out to dinner, a regular place we went to, and on the way home I had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. He wrote, "She was asleep before we reached the highway. She always does this on the way home from dinner. I have never told her that I find it one of the most comforting things in my life, the specific trust of a person who falls asleep in your car, like an argument that you don't have to have." I drove the long way home so she could sleep longer. I closed the notebook. I lay in the dark for a while. He drove the long way home so I could sleep longer. He was not a man who said things out loud. He was a man who drove the long way home. He was a man who wrote it down for 20 years and left the key in his coat. That is the whole of him. That is more than enough.